TD has released a shocking report that shows that inequality is now reaching 2015 levels. And not only that, you are seeing essentially Canada enter a depression. And it's going to be a silent depression because nobody, apart from people like me, are going to call a spade a spade. So anyway, let's get into what is going on. So inequality worsening as wealth gap widens to highest since 2015, according to this TD Bank report. So let's get into it. The gap between the highest earners and the lowest income groups last year was at its widest since 2015, as the wealthiest households saw income grow much faster than lower income Canadians. Higher interest rates are pushing middle and lower income households to spend more conservatively, which means consumer spending by the top earners will play a critical role in keeping the broader economy going. As the national household net worth rebounded to 4.5% last year from a 6.5% decline in 2022, the gains were not evenly distributed across all income levels, the report said. And you just have to think about it, guys, because a lot of the wealth that you see in Canada revolves around what? Housing prices. Real residential property prices in Canada have seen a historic decline. If you look at any of the declines in the past, none have been as severe as we have right now. And this chart goes all the way back to 1970. So over 50 years of data from the St. Louis Fed. And you can see that that decline has happened rapidly as well. And as I've said before in prior videos, you know, who gets affected first by a recession? Is it going to be the lower income groups, the middle ones, or the wealthy? It's going to be the lower income groups, and then the middle income groups, and then the wealthy last, and for the shortest period of time. And that's when you'll see the government come out and actually do something. It's no wonder that you're seeing this happen right now. But what's important to note is obviously if the wealth gap is widening, all this talk about GDP per capita that you've seen it everywhere, guys, all over the headlines. And this is one of those headlines. Canada is no longer one of the richest nations on earth. Country after country is passing us by. And it talks about per capita GDP a lot, which I've got on this chart. But what you have to remember, and I've pointed this out numerous times, is okay, this is a measure of wealth and prosperity within the economy, but it's equally divided. So obviously if the income distribution is completely uneven and it's just widening and widening and widening, as this TD report is suggesting, then obviously the GDP per capita, as I've said, is not accurate. You can have the wealthy people, their GDP per capita is rising. Meanwhile, at the expense of the middle and lower groups, which are seeing it tank. And that's exactly what you would expect with everything that's happening in Canada and the amount of household debt that we have in the system. Household income in the top category was average of $197,000 in 2023, up 6% from the previous year. Meanwhile, middle and low income households saw a stagnated growth or worse decline. And they're obviously probably measuring that against the inflation rate, or maybe they're not. Maybe that's nominal. They don't say. But just think about that for a second, because the inflation rate is complete nonsense. It's complete fiction. So, you know, people are seeing their real purchasing power drop off a cliff. That is going to have major ramifications for the economy, considering middle and low income earners are spending at the highest velocity. Wealthy people typically hoard money and put money into assets. They're not putting money into actual goods and services in the economy and helping economic growth. And especially in Canada, most of that money goes into real estate. And it's just so backward. And that's how the economy has started to revolve around real estate over the past decade, which is obviously devastating considering the debt spiral that we're in. So anyway, the report shows low-income households saw a gain of 0.3% at $31,518 average annual income. That is just crazy low when you think about it. I mean, how can anybody afford to live off that is beyond me. Most of those people earning that amount amount of money are going to be what? They're going to be either students or they're going to be immigrants that are earning that money. And they're going to be living in like what we would call squalor conditions with slumlords and all the rest of it in Canada. You've probably seen all of the stuff all over social media. A decline in real estate assets, meanwhile, affected middle and lower income households as mortgage debt increased. Middle income households became more indebted than before the pandemic years as mortgage renewals and debt servicing fees increased amid higher interest rates. So again, this just goes to show the severity of what's happening right now. And I want to get into the migration. I found this and it just had some really interesting charts about what is going on with immigration in Canada. So this is Canada's population versus California, essentially, very close, and obviously population. California's population is actually starting to decline, whereas you've got Canada has just gone completely parabolic. And then if you go down to net migration and net non-permanent resident inflows, you've seen this absolutely skyrocket. And again, this is exactly what the oligarchs want. And this is why neither any conservative or liberal or NDP is willing to address this, because they don't want to hurt the power structures in Canada that are in play. Because quite frankly, unfortunately, these people coming to the country right now are mostly non-skilled. They're going to go into low-skilled, low-paying jobs for the oligarchs, suppress wages, which the oligarchs love. We're doing a disservice to the people that are coming over, misled and manipulated, and then just thrown into a depression, essentially used and abused like a modern-day slave. It's just kind of absolutely crazy to me. And you look at the numbers here, and it's just no wonder. I mean, it's no wonder we're seeing rental prices skyrocket, even though it's still cheaper to rent than buy a home, which shows how the speculation is still completely out of control in Canada. And then they also had this chart, which I thought was just so interesting because it compares real house prices to population growth and wages, which Hilliard has done for a while. You've probably seen his charts on Twitter. He's been on the channel way back. HMacB, follow him on Twitter. Great guy. He has a great book as well. But anyway, when you look at this chart, how can anybody say that population growth is affecting housing prices? Now, indirectly it is, because it's going to lead to more speculation when the rental demand goes up, which it will, with all the non-skilled and non-permanent amount of people that are coming into Canada. You're seeing that obviously spike massively, and you're seeing non-permanent that is higher than actual permanent residents coming in, which is just crazy. So those people, they're going to have a delayed effect on housing prices, but most of this is purely to do with speculation. And as you can see, as I've said many times, all these people act like population growth is directly what's behind housing prices. Well, explain 2022 then. And they just can't explain it. Explain 2022 when we had record immigration and record housing price declines. How does that work? Explain what's happening right now with condo sales at a 15-year low in Toronto, which is the mega hub of where immigrants go. And they just can't explain it. And it's because it's all speculation and it's all smoke and mirrors when it comes to the real estate industry. And you can also see GDP per capita, which I think is incredibly interesting. You can see how it's just completely flat. And we've been through this so many times. And on this video as well, we've been through it. How when you look at the income distribution, it is collapsing. And in the United States, it's still actually rising. In Germany, it's still actually rising. In the UK, it's lower, but it's still actually rising ever so slightly. Whereas in Canada, it is just literally doing nothing. And then they also go into labor productivity, which again is another thing that we've talked about so much on this channel, because it just increases inflation and it's not good for the economy. It harms the economy. It harms growth. It's really bad when you've got productivity going down. But if you go up and look at housing prices at this insane height where nobody can essentially afford them, and it's only the wealthiest people that can accumulate these assets, and these assets are just entirely speculative, essentially, what are people working for? That's what you've got to ask the question. The incentive to work for that middle class life, people are giving up on that middle class life. And that is a major major issue, and no politician is addressing that. And no politician will ever address it. They might talk about addressing it, but the fact is the power structures, the monopolies, they all need to be broken up. The bureaucracy needs to be broken down. The government needs to be shrank hugely. And it's just not going to happen because so many people are dependent on the government, are dependent on government services. And that's the major issue that we now have. The government is so large and so bloated that that's a lot of voters you're talking about. And they put these government offices in places where, guess what? It is actually where they can sway the votes. You think that the government is stupid, but when it comes to power, they know exactly what they're doing when it comes to power and control. And that's exactly why we're seeing more censorship. We're seeing more authoritarian laws being put forward and put into practice, which is just absolutely terrible long term. And when you think about all the bureaucracy in Canada, that just discourages small businesses from starting up. I mean, again, the oligarchies love it. They love it if the government comes in and says, hey, we've got more and more extra hurdles for you to go through, because they've got the money to just pay their way through that. Whereas the small businesses that are trying to compete with those large companies, they don't have the money to deal with that. So it just continues to discourage growth and just continue with this consolidation that you see across airlines, you see it across grocery store chains, you see it across finance in Canada. I mean, it's just a monopoly in literally every industry. And it's sad that that has happened, but you have to break apart these bureaucracies, government. You have to bring down the cost of government. And I think it's very difficult to do that when so many people are now dependent on the government for a paycheck or dependent on the government for benefits. They don't understand how that all impacts inflation because the government actually takes away. It doesn't actually produce anything. It doesn't actually contribute to growth in a way apart from their spending, which shows growth, but it's not actually real growth. So it's kind of crazy when you think about what's going on here, guys. Again, you have to remember, you're going to hear this time and time again in multiple articles, GDP per capita, but you have to break it down. Obviously, if inequality is worsening, that's going to mean that GDP per capita for the middle and lowers is going way down, and that chart is not going to be reflective of that. So anyway, if you've enjoyed this video, I would highly recommend that you check out this video here. If you're looking for a VPN, go to expressvpn.com/marketmania to get around all the censorship laws in Canada, and I will see you on the next one. Take care, guys.